Great. Yeah, guys, I have to tell you, well, I know y'all are not listening. Not you guys, not you students, but the YouTube people. My, the challenge is just to get back onto this situation. Anyway, apparently, I haven't recorded what I thought I recorded. But anyway, we're going to do it again. Chapter 5, page 160. Integumentary System. And so we're going to cover this whole thing, this whole chapter, if we can do that. So as you look on page 161 of the skin, and so you want to know those terms that are associated with that illustration. Your skin is an organ. It's the biggest organ in your body. So you see you have on the left-hand side, you've got epidermis, top layer, middle layer is dermis, and then hypodermis is the tissue, which is adipose tissue and connective tissue and so forth, underneath the dermis. And you notice within, the dermis, there's sensory receptors. Let you know when you feel some breeze on your skin or some bug crawling on you. So you've got a number of different kinds of little nerves that we'll talk about. And then you see they don't have the hair labeled. Well, they do have the hair labeled over on the right-hand side, but we'll get into it a little bit more as we get into the chapter. They don't label the follicle, which is the bulbous structure at the bottom of the hair. And then you see a couple of glands there, which would be sebaceous glands or sweat glands. So anyway, you want to know those sweat glands and the adipose tissue. And let's move on over to where you see on page 162, functions of the skin. And so as you look down there, you see protection from pathogens. That's why you want to keep your skin healthy. Pathogens have a hard time getting through the skin. So we wash our hands as we've been encouraged to with COVID-19 and so forth. But the skin is usually pretty tough. Keeps microbes out and dirt out and so forth. And there's some protection from mechanical trauma. And then you come over to sensation. You've got receptors there, as we've already seen a little bit in that picture. And thermoregulation. There you have the homeostatic mechanism that we know goes on when we get too overheated. And you can read about that. You already know about homeostatic mechanisms. But you see down in that page 162, the second column, you've got stimulus, body temperature goes above normal, receptors pick that up, control centers up here, the hypothalamus, and then you have an effector, which in our case would be sweat glands. And so that's just one of the things that would help us dump some heat and cool the body down. Anyway, make sure you read that over again because you're already familiar with it. Oh my, and then you see excretion. We do produce some waste products there. So urea and lactic acid and so forth. And we'll talk about sweat a little bit more when we get to the glands. Vitamin D. Now here I want you to look at this whole paragraph. I want you to read it. It talks about how cholesterol gets converted to become vitamin D. You see, precursor of vitamin D is a modified cholesterol molecule. Now, everybody thinks cholesterol is horrible, and they want to get it down to zero, but we need cholesterol. It goes back to a homeostatic mechanism. So we just got to have that balance. So you can read through that, and it's going to be revealed to you that when this modified cholesterol is exposed to certain wavelengths, from ultraviolet radiation. That molecule is going to be converted to cholecalciferol. And then your liver and your kidney are going to work on it, and it's going to come up to be the next italicized word you see, which is calcitriol, the active form of vitamin D. And it's required for us to absorb calcium. And so we need that calcium for our bones. We think of it only as our bones, but it's involved in muscle contraction. You want to understand that. And also down there where you see apply what you've learned on 164. And let's go to module 5.2, the epidermis. Again, look at the learning outcomes, and they give you sort of a focus on what you want to pick up. You see the cells that make up our epidermis are called keratinocytes. So you come down to where you see that term keratinocytes, and as you look into that second column down at the bottom under keratinocytes, you can see that let's see, I got to get a little closer. They have the protein called keratin, fibrous protein, that's very tough. It's all, you're going to find out a little bit later, it's also a waterproofer, because we are always bumping into stuff and rubbing on things, and so it gives the skin a bit of toughness there. So you want to read about the keratin and those keratinocytes. Now, those are the cells that make up the epidermis. And when you think of the epidermis, it's not just the top portion. It's all the way from the bottom up. So you see the layers of the epidermis. And we start out with the stratum basal. And then we hit the stratum spinosum, the stratum granulosum, stratum lucidum on our hands and our feet, on the palms of your hands and on the soles of your feet. Excuse me. And then you have the top layer, stratum corneum. So as you look at stratum basal, deepest layer, as it says there, single layer of stem cells. Now, you've probably heard people talk about stem cells before. So there are cells that you can take, and sometimes you can transfer them to another part of the body, and they assume that they're part of that tissue, so they begin to work like that tissue does. People have put in stem cells for muscles and had some success at growing some new muscles, but in some little muscle fibers. So anyway, stem cells, they're going to be producing more keratinocytes. That's your source of skin there. So you don't want to damage that. That is what keeps making skin that we knock off all day long. We'll talk about that a little bit later too. So notice under stratum basal, when you come down about 6 or 7 lines, these cells produce vitamin D when we get out into the sun. And it's also called the stratum germinativum, which you think about germination of a seed, it means it's growing. So just another word for stratum basal. Now, if you look in the diagram, you'll see it labeled right above the dermis. And you'll see a little name there, dividing keratinocyte. But that's the basal layer, about a cell layer thick. And so the next layer up is called the stratum spinosum. Sometimes they have little spines on them when you make a smear out of them, but don't worry about that. That's just the name of the layer. And you see it's pretty thick. And so you come down to stratum spinosum at the bottom, and you read over to the next column there, and you look at they're mitotically active, they're dividing. And then you look at the last sentence about stratum spinosum, and you see it says they help to produce vitamin D. Well, they came from cells that produce vitamin D, so they maintain that capability to make vitamin D. Remember, it starts with a cholesterol molecule, and then it gets ultraviolet rays on it, and and eventually it begins to activate vitamin D, which we need to get calcium out of our foods through our GI tract. The next layer, which is not nearly as thick as the stratum spinosum, is called stratum granulosum. So that's got granules in it. That's why they call it that. And let's see what I want you to know here. As you look at the first paragraph under stratum granulosum, look at the last sentence in that little paragraph. One of the granules contains keratin bundles, and the other is a lipid-based substance. We'll talk about that in a little bit. So you see in the second column, second paragraph under stratum granulosum, talks about this lipid-based substance coats the keratinocytes. So it's like a little bit of a layer of protection and waterproofing. If you come down to the third line there in the second paragraph, recall that lipids are hydrophobic. They repel water. And so look at the last three lines. This lipid coats our cells as a water barrier and prevents us losing water as well as gaining water through the skin. So that helps to keep our water balance. That's just one aspect of keeping our water balanced in our bodies. So you look over on page 166, and it'll mention in the first couple of sentences about internal fluid, which is your water balance. And then you see electrolyte homeostasis. Think of the sodium and potassium and chlorine and so forth, and calcium. Let's come to the stratum lucidum, and that is present on your hands and on the bottom of your feet, not on the backside, but here. So because that's where we're always rubbing our hands on things, picking them up. So it gives us a little bit of protection in terms of what we might come in contact with. Stratum corneum, that's the very top layer of your skin. And you see it says in the third line down, they have lost their normal organelles and are a little more than just bundles of keratin. And so the reason that's the case is they're not living anymore, because you're going to find in your towel, they're going to be on your sheets. And you got little mites that live in the carpet and live in your bed with you, and they eat your skin cells, and then they defecate. And so pretty soon we're sleeping in a bed full of mites and their waste products. So we wash it once a week. It's amazing what we come in contact with. Just utterly amazing. Some people are actually allergic to, they call them dust mites. They might produce some proteins that irritate some people. Most people, I don't think, have that problem. They're also called Langerhans. It's a person's name. Sometimes they name these cells after a person when they have discovered it. Phagocytic. So it's a nerve to brown black. Okay. Of the body. Now, we have hair on the, but we do have sweat glands. So We can get kind of clammy and wet on the palms of our hands, but we don't get any hair growing there. If you'll look on page 168, some of you, when you look in that first column and you come to the second paragraph, you see the word callus in bold print. Some of you may play an instrument like a violin, or you may play guitar, or a mandolin, or a bass, or something like that. And you can get a little buildup of tissue like that that sometimes puts pressure on and hurts you. Some people shave it off. Be good to just get another pair of shoes that fits you better, and then you won't have all these calluses that put pressure on you and hurt, cause a little bit of pain. You can get calluses here. What you do. I used to split wood as a young man, and you would get calluses right here where the fingers join the palm. And that's just because that handle was rubbing against my skin, and the skin got a little thicker. Now, let's leave, and you will see where it says papillary layer and reticular layer. That's going to be the dermis. Epidermis is up top. Dermis is below the epidermis. Now, having said that, look at the second column where you see the papillary layer of the dermis. Little finger-like projections. Now, those are microscopic, okay? They have drawn them big so that we can see those. But they're called papillae. And if you come down to the third line under papillary layer, when you get to that paragraph, the third line right about figure 0.5, it says it consists of loose connective tissue. And what I want you to notice as you come down about line 8, it says at the dermis-epidermis junction, dermis-epidermis junction, the epidermis and the papilla, and you can get fluid in there, and that's what you call a blister. Most of us have had a blister, probably along the heels or something like that. And so it creates a bit of discomfort, but we live through it. Now come to the second paragraph under the papillary layer, and you see it says the surface of papillary layer where it contacts the epidermis is folded into projection called papillae, and they have tiny blood vessels in the papilla. If you'll look over at the dermal papillae, those little ridges, and look inside them over to the left, and you'll see capillaries. That's where oxygen leaves the capillaries, carrying blood, and got nutrition, got good gases, but it takes away the carbon dioxide, or it takes away the wastes that our cells produce. And so if you notice in the papillary layer where they have capillaries, that's as far as the blood goes. It will nourish the basal and the spinosum. Remember those layers? But once you get up to the lucidum and the corneum, stratum corneum, they're too far away from the blood, so they die. So like I said, we had dead skin all across us there. You look on page 169, up at the top, you see Meissner's corpuscles. Those are little nerve endings. And let's come down to the reticular layer. Notice that's at the underneath to some degree in all the different directions. Okay, let's go over to skin markings on page 169. And if you come down in that little section, you'll see in the bottom line, or the next 3 lines at the bottom, here the dermal papillae are extremely prominent. Thick collagen fibers arrange them into ridges, and then the structure indents the overlying epidermis. Look at the top of page 170, second paragraph, and you will see the bold print term fingerprints. So the papillae play a role in making ridges under our skin that are genetically ours. And so that's why we often, in a crime scene, look for fingerprints. Your prints are different from my prints. And so if we can find your prints on something, they'll say, those are your prints. And, you're the one who did such and such. So we use that in a court of law. So as you're on 170, look in the second column and you come down, make sure you do number 5 on the quick check. And you can also do number 1 under apply what you have learned. Module 5.4 on page 171. As you look at the bottom, and we're talking about skin pigmentation and melanin, the substance that's produced, you look down at the bottom, and here's this melanocyte. So look at the very bottom of the illustration. You'll see a big melanocyte, kind of brown colored, and that's a cell that's going to produce melanin. Now, as you look at that cell, what is that kind of light purple sphere? What is that? And you see some sort of blue material around that structure. What is that? What is that green structure? See how you go all the way back to chapter 3. We are bringing it up here and applying it to the integumentary system. So the melanocyte, if you look at the top of the second column, produces that bold print term, which is actually a substance, not a term, but melanin. And that's where we get our color of our skin. And as we've already mentioned, it can be orange red to black. And so you got a lot of different shades of those colors. Now, as you read in that first paragraph, it's going to say that melanin is made from the amino acid tyrosine. And there's actually an enzyme there called tyrosine. Pigment melanin made from that amino acid is what is in these bodies called melanosomes. Sometimes it's kind of challenging to say these, isn't it? Melanosomes. Little vesicles. Remember we talked about vesicles back in chapter 3. Now, as you come down into the second paragraph, where you see number 2, a little circled number 2, the melanocytes. Okay, it says melanosomes migrate to the tips of their arms. Look again down at the bottom of that picture, 5.8, and you got these little fingers sticking out. Some of them would call them arms, but those little melanocyte synthesizing melanin in the melanosomes, those are the things, the little bodies, the vesicles that go out those projections. And if you notice up in that second column on page 171, you see where you see the number 2 in that second paragraph, circled number 2, small number 2, it says melanosomes migrate to the tip of the arms where they are released by exocytosis. There we are back in chapter 3 again. You need to remember what exocytosis is. See, we just keep adding to what we have already studied. Go back and review it. Okay, and then we come on down a couple of lines. It says the melanosome enters the cytosol, that's cytoplasm, same thing, or enters the extracellular fluid next to the keratinocyte Endocytosis is the overall term. So anyway, it gets inside the cell. And notice as you keep reading in that little paragraph that the melanin is, let's see, what is it?
Somatic. But another girl was 2, and then the third one, they need an option. Some people are elderly and they want to stay home for a while, and I advise it. And then some people have health issues, and I advise it.
Sure.
So I'm fine. It had been about 3 weeks ago, but I'd rather be safe than sorry. I don't want anybody coming and it's John, pray for me. Emotional experience I've ever been through because I did work 3 days that week, and so all of us had to contact every single person that was in our shop, and I'd say I had about 16 that went and got tested, and they were all negative. But a lot of them was elderly.
Yeah.
Yeah, this happened to be a week I did, a lot of elderly people. And one was even 95 in a wheelchair.
Wow.
But she was fine. Not one soul yet has tested positive. So evidently, and I did have no symptoms. I eventually ended up with a cough and a little bit of achiness and tiredness. But that's the worst I ever got.
So glad.
He was fine too.
Wow.
And he's 10 beings had a heart attack. So he did great, and we all did great. Nobody's been really sick. The first little girl who was only part-time, but her husband works in the hospital, had COPD anyhow. So she's had a little bit of anything. So, but let's see. Next week is the 4th. You want to go maybe?
We need to put it off a little bit, and so we're going to do that. Through okay, though. Boy, you never know. Second 12 lines or so, it says the melanin is transported to the region superficial to the nucleus, which is right above the nucleus. If you look at the picture down below, you see those keratinocytes, and you see the granules, and they're labeled as melanin. And those granules protect our DNA. So it doesn't stop every ray, but it does give us a degree of protection. And it eventually breaks down, and we have to keep making more and more. So the nuclei of our skin, the functions of melanin is to protect the DNA keratinocytes from mutations induced by ultraviolet radiation. So that's its purpose, and it does a pretty good job if we're careful with it. Produce complete protection, but it does give us some protection. Now, if you come down to them, keeps us healthy for the most part. Come on down to the very identical, among the last little word there about albinism. And so that's where they don't have the ability to produce that pigment melanin. Okay, so we know about melanin comes from an amino acid